It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the LG 32GK850G. This video accompanies a longer and more detailed written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how it can support the work that we do. This model features a 31.5-inch VA panel, more specifically an AU Optronics AMVA Advanced Multi-Domain Vertical Alignment panel. This supports a 165Hz refresh rate, has support for NVIDIA G-Sync as well, and it has a 2560 by 1440 or WQHD resolution. So that resolution on a screen of this size gives you a similar pixel density to a 23 or 24-inch 16 by 9 Full HD monitor. So icons are pretty big, text's fairly large and readable, although not massive, but it's a pixel density that many people find quite comfortable, and you get plenty of desktop real estate for doing work or browsing the internet, whatever you happen to be doing, and it also gives you good space for multitasking as well. In terms of viewing images, gaming, movies, that kind of thing, the pixel density is pretty good, but it's not astounding by modern monitor standards, so it doesn't give you the same kind of detail and clarity as you'd get from a 27-inch WQHD monitor, for example, but it's not awful either, so it's pretty decent in that respect, really. And the screen size itself, it's not really easy to appreciate how large it is from the video. My keyboard's there, that's a full-size keyboard, and it doesn't have a separate numpad and arrow keys, but it's I think it's a full-size keyboard or fairly large keyboard, normal-size mouse. Screen, pretty big. When you're sitting in a normal viewing position at a desk, I like to sit around 70 or 80 centimeters from it, and from that distance I find it's a nice size to use and it gives a good immersive experience. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. Most notable is the large screen itself. This has a light matte anti-glare screen surface, so it offers quite good glare handling. I'm actually in a rather bright room at the moment, so you can see some degree of glare on the screen, but you don't see sharp reflections like you'd get on a glossy screen, and once you actually turn the monitor on, the light from the monitor competes quite effectively and the glare is not such an issue. But with any screen surface you shouldn't really have strong light striking the screen surface directly, and you shouldn't really have strong lights behind you. For example, there's light streaming through a door behind me there. I could of course close the door, and I would if I was actually using the monitor, but the light matte anti-glare does give a better quality to the image, better clarity, better potential vibrancy than stronger matte surfaces, and less of a grainy look, and I'll explore that in more detail in the actual review a bit later on. The bottom bezel is a kind of painted semi-matte black with a central white coloured LG logo. The bezels at the top and side have a frameless design or dual bezel design, so you've got a thin hard outer plastic component as well as a thin panel border, and that panel border blends in seamlessly when the monitor's off, as you can see now, and when it's on you can just see that as a thin border around the image. As is very common with models with dual bezel designs like this, there are actually small dots. You can see one there, there's one on the other side on the top right corner as well. They're not defects, they're actually part of the alignment process used by the machines that put these all together and assemble everything, so it's not a defect. The stand has a sort of Y-shaped or penguin foot design. It's pretty solid. You can see a bit of red at the back as well. I'll show you that in a bit more detail shortly when I look at the rear of the monitor. The OSD controls, which I go through in a separate video, they're located at the rear of the monitor in the centre. At the side of the monitor there's nothing particularly exciting to report. It's sort of a mixture of matte black plastic with a sort of central glossy strip, and you can see the fully adjustable stand in more detail from this angle as well, and the red striping at the rear of the stand base is clearer as well. At the rear the monitor is a mixture of matte black plastic and matte red plastic. You can see the red styling elements more clearly, including at the bottom of the stand base. There's also a sort of red ring at the top of the stand neck, and a red ring around the central area, and that is the sphere lighting feature, so you can control the colours of the LED through the OSD, and that's explored in the OSD video. The stand attaches centrally, and it has a quick release mechanism. There's a little button just under the stand attachment point there, and that will remove the screen from the stand, and you can replace it with a 100 by 100mm VESA compatible stand or mount of your choice if you prefer. The ports are located to the right of the stand attachment point. There are two USB 3 ports. You can see that they also have a little lightning icon. If you look closely, that means that they support fast charging as well. There's a DisplayPort 1.2 input and an HDMI 1.4 input. There's also a USB 3 upstream port, which is essential to actually use data from those ports there. And there's a service port which says do not use, that's just for the service centre usage. There's a headphone jack, 3.5mm headphone jack. There's also a DC power input, which means that the monitor has an external power brick, which you can see here. I'm now running Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, and I'm going to talk about contrast performance of this monitor. The contrast is really the main strength of a VA model such as this. I measured a static contrast just a bit short of 3000 to 1, depends on the settings you're using on the monitor, but essentially it gives an experience with static contrast that's well beyond what you'd get on any non-VA LCD panel without any sort of HDR capability or anything like that. So it gives a fairly good depth to dark areas of the image. There's plenty of sort of mixed content here, some really nice deep dark shades there, good shadow detail. You get that kind of thing on this model. And bright elements such as the electricity there contrast really well with the surrounding darkness. It sort of pops out very nicely. There are a few weaknesses. First of all, it doesn't give you the same kind of inky depth you get on some VA models with much stronger static contrast. Sometimes it's around double what this one has, but as I said, it does really put non-VA LCDs to shame in terms of static contrast. The other issue is that it has a small amount of black crush. This is explored a bit more in the written review, but what this is dark shades which are a little bit lighter than black actually appear a bit darker than they should because of the perceived gamma behaviour. When you're looking directly in front of the monitor as the camera is positioned now, some areas of detail are lost slightly, so you get a little bit of subtle detail lost because of this black crush and because some of these shades just appear a bit darker than they should. It's actually very minor on this model. It's as minor as I've seen on a VA model, so I thought it was worth mentioning, but it's not really something that I see upsetting gameplay, and it doesn't upset the overall atmospheric look of dark scenes on this monitor. Being a VA panel, there is a little bit of so-called VA glow, and this is where darker shades appear slightly lighter towards the extreme edges of the screen or bottom of the screen, particularly towards the corners, the bottom corners of the screen from a normal viewing position. But it's as minor as I've seen on a VA model. It lightens up the shades slightly, but the overall atmosphere is very good, and it's a lot lower than the level of VA glow you'd see on curved competitors to this model, for example, or the current ones that I've reviewed anyway. And the level of detail that's lost from that is really very minor, and certainly if you're comparing it to IPS glow, it's really nothing compared to that. And indeed, compared to the kind of vertical gamma shifts and therefore the effect on dark details that you get on TN models as well, it's really nothing compared to that. So the overall atmosphere and dark scenes on this monitor is very good. Last but not least, it's worth mentioning a bit about the screen surface. As I mentioned before, it's very light matte anti-glare, so it doesn't have an obvious graininess to it. It doesn't have the kind of absolute smooth purity of or pop of a glossy screen, but it certainly doesn't have the kind of smeary graininess associated with some matte surfaces either, so it's a pretty good compromise really. And I'm going to talk about colour reproduction, and to start this off, before I get into some in-game testing, I like to look at the Lagom test for viewing angles because it helps highlight some of the weaknesses in colour consistency associated with various different panel types, such as the VA panel used here. With VA models, you tend to get a kind of circle or a cone in the middle where the gamma is different to the rest of the screen, and that causes some changes in saturation as well as some changes in detail levels for dark shades, as I had mentioned earlier in terms of the black crush. On this model, the shifts from a normal viewing position, so when comparing the centre of the screen to the edge, are actually quite minor, for a VA model of this size anyway. You can see with the Lagom text that it looks more blended towards the middle and it has a bit of a red striping further out, but it still appears fairly well blended. There aren't any kind of like transitions between bright reds or orange, anything like that. But if you move around, the cone kind of moves around with you, and that central area of viewing always appears a bit more blended relative to the rest. So if you observe a solid shade, so Lagom sort of highlights these differences quite well with big areas of solid shade, and it's not always obvious in the video, but what I can see from a normal viewing position, or more or less normal viewing position, is that the sort of saturation is a bit stronger centrally and there's more of a lilac shade, whereas around the edges, near the extreme edges in particular, near the bottom as well, there's more of a pink hue to the purple block. And that pink hue moves around with head movement. With this red shade, less extreme shifts, but again, it's kind of a bit of pink towards the bottom and the sides, but particularly towards the bottom, but near the side in the bottom region. And again, as you move, there are kind of brightness shifts and some saturation shifts as well. So the most saturated shades appear centrally. And I mean, I'm not really going to go through all of these. Green's fairly consistent on this model. There's a little bit of yellowing. Basically, these shifts are quite normal for VA models. On this one, the shifts are actually fairly minor. How pronounced the shifts are depend on the viewing position. So if you're closer, then the shifts are more pronounced. There's more of an obvious change in saturation and brightness towards the edge. Further away, not such a problem. And from my preferred viewing position of sort of 65 to 80 centimetres, I find the colour consistency of this model good for a VA panel. I'm now on Battlefield 1 and I'm going to talk a bit more about colour reproduction. The colour gamut of this model extends a little bit beyond sRGB. I measured a small amount of under coverage in some regions, a little bit of over coverage in other regions. So what that means is it doesn't have the kind of vibrant pop that some models have with a more generous colour gamut and more extension beyond sRGB. But I would never describe the image as washed out on this model. I describe it as rich and natural looking. It's certainly got some pretty deep shades, some pretty vibrant shades on display. And compared to my Dell S2716DG, which is a model I use for reference when gaming, this model looks quite a bit richer, more vibrant, and that's when comparing to the Dell fully calibrated with its ICC profile and everything enabled. So you can see a nice range of deep and lush looking green shades, a nice range of more subtle pastel green shades as well, a good variety of earthy browns. And this all creates a very natural look to the environments on the game. Things look believable, things look in place, but some of the deeper shades such as the rich blues and reds on that flag, and some of the oranges from explosions and that kind of thing, they're pretty vibrant. These flowers as well, they stand out fairly nicely. So again, it's not going to have the kind of arresting vibrancy that some models have, particularly ones with much wider colour gamut. But it does look pretty rich and natural, and I don't really consider the colours to look anywhere near washed out. There is some loss of saturation and things look a bit more muted towards the edge, but this is pretty subtle. It's the shifts I showed you on Lagom earlier. They're a lot less obvious when you're gaming because you don't have individual blocks of a single colour, and you don't tend to have your eyes drawn to these shifts in the same way. And even considering the extremities of the screen, most of the shades are actually pretty consistent, and even towards the edge they actually maintain good richness. And certainly if you're comparing to some VA models of this size, the shifts are much less pronounced. It's actually quite similar to the curved models I've used, and they're very impressive for VA panels in terms of the colour consistency. There are shifts, and for that reason I wouldn't really recommend this model or any VA model for colour critical work, but for gaming and general purpose use, I really don't think most users are going to have an issue with this. I'm on Battlefield 1 again, and I'm on one of my favourite scenes for talking about responsiveness on monitors, and in particular VA panels. There are plenty of high contrast transitions, plenty of shades they're pretty dark, and these introduce pixel transitions which VA models in particular tend to struggle with. Usually with a VA model you'd see an obvious or fairly obvious smeary trailing behind the horse as you move. On this model you don't see that at all, and you might see something similar with these rocks, and again there's no such thing here. These rocks in the background as well. There's a very small sort of blue fringe, and that's what I call breakup trailing, but usually this would sort of look like you're wetting a page with some fountain pen ink on it, and it kind of runs as you move. But with this model it's really quite subtle, the breakup trailing, and I call it breakup trailing because there are colours other than just pure black which are contained here, although it looks fairly black when you look at it, at least in person it does. Same with this horse. There are actually some other shades contained within that, such as very dark blues and purples and that kind of colour, and they tend to leach out on VA models due to sluggish pixel transitions, and you can kind of see them break up, and that's why I call them breakup trailing. On this it's really not an issue at all. It isn't because of any sort of incredible voodoo, although this panel does seem to be very fast, and that's extremely important when it comes to this this kind of thing, but it is actually replaced with a bit of overshoot. You can see the overshoot more clearly if you look at the little icon on top of the horse. I'm not sure how this will appear on the camera, but I can see a definite kind of overshoot trail behind that. There's a little bit behind the horse, and this, what I call breakup trailing here, might even be a little bit of overshoot. You can see a kind of slight halo trail, which is brighter than, or snail slime trail as I like to call it. So it's kind of semi-transparent, a little fringe around the air rock as I move. It's a bit brighter than the background colour as well as the rock, which is why it kind of stands out a bit. But this isn't extreme overshoot at all. It's not eye-catching to me when I'm gaming, and I don't find it bothersome. I am quite used to gaming on the Dell S2716DG, and I find the overshoot more noticeable on that model. So this is actually not bad in that respect at all. And usually on VA models, when they're this, the pixel responses are this fast, they'll either have extreme overshoot or they'd kind of have a bit of a compromise with a bit of overshoot and some smeary trailing. This model has really done very well with very fast pixel transitions, faster than I've seen on any VA model. Another aspect of this is the fact that it's a 165Hz monitor. I explore in the written review and link to an article about the factors which affect perceived blur, and the articles affecting responsiveness on a monitor more broadly. And perceived blur is something which is contributed to by the pixel responsiveness, which I've already talked about a bit, but also the movement of your own eyes as you track motion on the screen. So this is something which is reduced significantly at high refresh rate, and really for minimal perceived blur you not only want a high refresh rate and a high frame rate, because you do need a suitably high frame rate to take advantage, ideally 165 frames a second on this model. If you've got really snappy pixel responses as you have here, and also have a high refresh rate and high frame rate, then the perceived blur levels are very low, and actually I don't feel there's a strong competitive disadvantage using this model compared to my Dell S2716DG, and in fact the 165 Hz and 165 frames a second versus 144 Hz and 144 frames a second, it actually gives a little bit of an edge in perceived blur. So in some respects I actually prefer gaming on this compared to my very fast TN Dell model. Again, yes, you can see some examples of the overshoot here, but they're not particularly eye-catching. But to me, sensitivity to overshoot does vary. So some users do find this a bit bothersome, and I can't really argue with that. But to me, it's okay. It's quite strong in some places, like around the moon there. But I personally feel that this is preferable to the kind of smeary trailing you get on most VA models. And there's a little bit of powdery trailing here and there, but it's really very faint, and even actually fainter than you generally see on high refresh rate IPS type models, so it's not something that's eye-catching to me at all, and it doesn't really significantly impact the perceived blur. The other aspect of the high refresh rate, high frame rate combination is that the connected feel when you're actually interacting with the game world is very good. All aspects of this video that I'm showing you have to understand that what you see depends on your own monitor, depends on the YouTube video, processing done, etc, etc. So there's no way I can actually show you exactly what this looks like, and certainly how it feels when you're actually using the monitor in the game. That's something you really have to experience yourself, but I describe it as having excellent connected feel. So when you interact with the game world, there's a certain precision and a certain kind of just a connectedness to the game world that you just don't feel at lower refresh rates and lower frame rates, regardless of the input lag. And the input lag on this model is very low. Should have really mentioned that before. It's not an issue at all. Quite often with VA models, these transitions here between these implements and the much lighter painted background behind it show some weaknesses. On here you can see a little bit of powdery trailing, a little bit of overshoot, but no strong overshoot and no obvious smeary trailing, so it's actually very good. I did mention there's a slightly stronger overshoot there, and if you're playing, I've noticed on this title there are transitions between very light shades and medium shades, which aren't really very common on this map, but if you, for example, play a foggy map, the overshoot tends to be more visible, and I talk about, or I write about that in the written review a bit more, but again, even then, I don't find it extreme and I don't find it bothersome. Some users wouldn't like it though. But there's quite flexibility. Quite a bit of flexibility. I'm actually using the faster response time, which is the fastest you can use on this, because I think it puts the 165 Hz frame rate to very good use. I realise it said 164 Hz there. I'm not quite sure why it says that. It's definitely running at 165 Hz, but perhaps it's because I've got G-Sync active and it's fluctuating a little bit. You can set that to fast, and what that does is it slightly reduces the overshoot, but you do get some more powdery trailing. You don't really get any obvious smeary trailing, although you do get something which, I suppose, more extended powdery trailing, you might say. And even so, the overshoot's not reduced massively, so I just, at least at 165 Hz. So I don't particularly find this setting advantageous. I prefer to use faster, but that's a personal preference. Some users might prefer the fast mode instead. If you go down to normal, it pretty much eliminates any traces of overshoot, so if you're sensitive to overshoot, that's perhaps a good thing. However, you then get smeary trailing, you get a much greater level of perceived blur, and it just doesn't really put the 165 Hz refresh rate to very good use. So you can see like an obvious kind of breakup trailing, which I was describing before now around this Telegraph post. But you don't see overshoot around the moon and that kind of thing. So I prefer to use the faster setting. Some users would prefer fast. The monitor also supports NVIDIA G-Sync. I've actually just increased the graphics settings to try and reduce my frame rate a bit. And what that means is the monitor will adjust its refresh rate to match the frame rate of the content. And usually if you're running a monitor with V-Sync on and it doesn't have G-Sync or variable refresh rate technology, you get obvious stuttering where the frame rate departs from the refresh rate of the display. If you've got VSync off, you'd instead get tearing, which sensitive users such as me find very obvious and not attractive at all. With with G-Sync, you don't get those issues. I don't know if you can see the small little refresh rate indicator there, but it's fluctuating quite a bit, but it does drop a fair bit below 165 every now and then. It's pretty high. I've actually got a GTX 1080 Ti in my system at the moment, running this game at the moment, so the frame rate's still pretty high anyway, even with ultra settings. However, there are departures from 165, some drops, and without G-Sync you'd notice obvious tearing or stuttering. If I increase the resolution scale significantly, I can reduce the frame rate further, and I immediately feel the difference. You won't be able to see from the video, but the connected feel is very much lost, even though G-Sync is active. Thankfully there isn't tearing or stuttering, and I find this, and most users find this particularly jarring at frame rates like this, 75 frames a second. So that's really nice to not have that. But as frame rate reduces, you do get worse connected feel, and the level of perceived blur also increases significantly. So you do really want to have your frame rate as high as possible, but at least with G-Sync you get a bit of headroom below that, a bit of flexibility to increase your graphics settings and not worry so much about drops below that. As with every G-Sync monitor, this model goes as low as 30 Hz on the hardware side with G-Sync, and below that the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay as well. The view I'm using in this game, in this particular scene, I can't really get anywhere near that kind of frame rate very easily at all anyway, so I can't really show you that, but either way you wouldn't be able to see it from the video anyway. However, I don't like to be anywhere near that kind of frame rate. I would definitely adjust my graphics settings if possible to ideally get triple digit frame rates, and really for me the higher the better. But sensitivity to this does vary, but I find most users find G-Sync a nice feature to have anyway. In conclusion, I find there's a lot to like about this monitor. The screen size itself allows for an immersive experience. The 2560 by 1440 resolution offers you a good amount of real estate on the screen. The pixel density is not particularly high, so it doesn't give you the kind of clarity and detail levels that some models with higher pixel density would offer. The pixel density is similar to a 24-inch or 23 to 24-inch 16 by 9 full HD model. So text is pretty readable. The size of buttons and icons, etc. on the desktop, all pretty decent. The VA panel offers strong contrast. That's really its main strength. It's the main strength of any VA panel. It's roughly around the 3000 to 1 specified, a little bit lower depending on the settings you're using, but it certainly offers strong static contrast, which is well beyond what other non-VA LCD models offer. The other strength in terms of the contrast is the fact that it does have a little bit of VA glow, but it's actually pretty low. Same with the black crush. There's a little bit of black crush, but it's not extreme on this model at all. The screen surface, very light matte anti-glare, so it doesn't have obvious graininess to it. It keeps things looking pretty smooth. It also helps the vibrancy potential. Speaking of vibrancy, the colour gamut of this model extends a little bit beyond sRGB in some regions, whereas in other regions there's a small amount of undercoverage. What this means is it doesn't have the kind of arresting vibrancy or the pop of some models with much more generous colour gamuts. But I would never describe it as washed out, and certainly compared to my Dell S2716DG, even when that's fully calibrated and profiled, this actually looks a lot richer. And so it has a rich and natural look when it's set up correctly. And I mean, there are plenty of quite vibrant looking shades, some good deep looking shades, and certainly the contrast helps with that as well. Being a VA model, there are some losses of saturation towards the edge of the screen and lower down, and things just look a little bit duller, but these shifts from a reasonable viewing distance, say 65 centimeters plus, I find the shifts as low as I've seen for a VA model of this size, and I'd say they're on par with the curved VA models of this size, which are actually very good in that respect. I wouldn't advise using any VA model for colour critical work because of the gamma shifts and the saturation shifts associated with them, but certainly for general purpose use in gaming, I find this model gives a nice image. Responsiveness is actually probably the most impressive aspect of this monitor, most impressive because it's usually a key weakness of VA models. This monitor has a 165Hz refresh rate, and it puts that to very good use. It has very rapid pixel responses. There is a bit of overshoot, and I know some users don't like overshoot, but it's sort of unavoidable when you have to use the level of acceleration that's required on a VA panel such as this for some of the transitions. But what that means is instead of, you get some overshoot here and there, but you don't get obvious smeary transitions, and you actually don't get any obvious breakup trailing, and you don't even get any what I describe as heavy powdery trailing either. You do get some weaker than optimal pixel transitions, and so there is a little bit of powdery trailing here and there, but overall it makes very good use of the 165Hz refresh rate, has a very low level of perceived blur, and it has a very good connected feel as well, and that's aided by the fact it has very low input lag. It also offers NVIDIA G-Sync, and that worked absolutely fine on this model. It did its thing, got rid of tearing and stuttering, and it allowed the frame rate to drop a little bit without it being quite as noticeable. I'd actually say, I don't like to draw direct comparisons like this too much, and it is a bit subjective, but for me, I would quite happily trade my Dell S2716DG, which is one of my main gaming monitors, for this monitor. I wouldn't say I'm a competitive gamer, but I do like to do well in games like Battlefield 1 and the Battlefield series, and I quite happily use this instead of my Dell, because I don't feel it puts me at any real competitive disadvantage. And that's really not something I've been able to say with any VA model I've tested. I'd probably say the same about IPS type models I've tested of high refresh rate, but even then there's some sort of weaknesses there which don't exist on this model even, let alone the TN model. So really the responsiveness is a very surprising and strong attribute of this model. The lighting feature, it's explored in more detail in the OSD video, but you can see I've got it set to green at the moment just to show you that it does actually light up behind the monitor quite effectively. This isn't even a dark room, it's a pretty dim room at the moment, but it's not completely dark, so it's quite an effective bias lighting, and you can change the colour as explored in the OSD video, so I quite like the feature. The overall build quality I find decent as well, it's pretty solid. There aren't any obvious features that scream gaming monitor to me, there aren't any obvious bright flashes of colour. There's a little bit of sort of red striping here and there, as I showed earlier in the video, but there's nothing which I find that looks tacky or really sort of looks out of place for a monitor which, as in my case, is actually in the living room. So really it's sort of a centerpiece of my living room, and I don't really sort of feel I have to cover it up when I've got guests around or anything like that. So that's really all there is to the LG 32GK850G. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, as well as information about how you can support the work that we do.